The silent witness at the village auction, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins at the village auction, where friendly smiles, polite bidding, and harmless competition fill the hall. Among the items on display is something ordinary, easily overlooked, yet quietly observed by everyone in the room. When a sudden death follows the auction, the villagers dismiss it as coincidence, an unfortunate turn of events no one connects to the evening's sale. Miss Marple, however, notices what others ignore: a pause before a bid, a nervous glance across the room, and an object that passed from one hand to another far too carefully. She soon realizes that something present at the auction witnessed more than anyone suspects, and though it cannot speak, its silence points directly toward the truth. Before we uncover what the auction truly revealed, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Silent Witness at the Village Auction. The auction day arrived beneath a sky the color of old paper, neither bright nor dark, but heavy with the promise of things long forgotten. St. Mary Mead stirred earlier than usual, doors opening, curtains shifting, footsteps echoing along the narrow lanes that all led toward the village hall. It was not merely an auction. It was a reckoning of the past, disguised as polite commerce and careful smiles. Miss Jane Marple observed the movement from her sitting-room window, her knitting resting idle in her lap. She had lived long enough to recognize the difference between excitement and unease. This was the latter. People moved too quickly, spoke too brightly, and laughed a little too loudly, as though noise itself might keep something buried. The auction had been arranged after the death of Arthur Bellamy, a man known for his silence more than his generosity. He had lived alone at Willow End Cottage, kept few friends, and attended village gatherings only when duty demanded it. Now his belongings, collected over decades, were to be scattered among neighbors who claimed fond memories they had never voiced while he lived. Miss Marple rose, set her knitting aside, and prepared to attend. She told herself she was merely curious, though she knew better. Curiosity was often the first sign of trouble. The village hall smelled of polish and dust when she arrived. Rows of chairs faced a low stage where tables displayed items tagged with neat white cards. Teacups with chipped rims. Framed photographs whose subjects stared stiffly from another age. A brass clock that no longer ticked. Each object waited patiently, as though aware it would soon change hands. Villagers gathered in clusters, murmuring softly. Mrs. Price examined a silver tray with narrowed eyes. Colonel Harding stood near the back, arms crossed, scanning the room as though expecting an ambush. Near the stage stood Gerald Pike, the auctioneer, clearing his throat repeatedly, his smile practiced and thin. Miss Marple took a seat near the aisle. From here she could observe without being observed, a skill she had perfected over a lifetime. The auction began without ceremony. Bids rose and fell. Hands lifted, nodded, withdrew. Objects passed from table to box with mechanical efficiency. Yet beneath the rhythm, something felt wrong. Miss Marple noticed it first when the mirror appeared. It was an ordinary-looking mirror, oval, framed in dark wood. The glass was clouded slightly, not with age alone, but with something else, something uneven. A white card hung from the frame. Lot 27. The room quieted as it was brought forward. No one spoke. No one smiled. The silence stretched longer than expected. Lot 27, Gerald Pike announced, his voice faltering for the first time. An antique mirror from Willow End Cottage. Miss Marple leaned forward. The mirror had hung, she recalled, in Arthur Bellamy's hallway. She had seen it once, years ago, during a charity visit. She remembered feeling uneasy then, though she could not have said why. It was not vanity that clung to it, but memory. The sort that watched. Bidding began slowly. Mrs. Price raised her hand, then lowered it almost at once. Colonel Harding shifted his weight but did not bid. A young man at the back lifted his hand hesitantly, then looked around, as though seeking permission. Miss Marple watched faces, not hands. She saw tension in clenched jaws, in eyes that refused to meet the glass. When the mirror finally sold, it was to Eleanor Grant, the schoolteacher, whose smile trembled as she accepted the claim ticket. As the mirror was carried away, Miss Marple noticed something odd. The glass caught the light and reflected the room, but one reflection lingered longer than the rest. A shadow near the door. A shape that did not move when others did. Her needles lay forgotten again. The auction continued, yet the mood had shifted. Conversations faltered. Teacups rattled faintly in saucers. When the final lot was sold and chairs scraped back, relief passed through the room like a sigh. Miss Marple lingered. She approached the table where the mirror had rested. The surface bore a faint outline, as though the mirror had pressed itself into the wood. She traced the mark lightly with one finger. That mirror saw more than it showed, she murmured. Behind her, a voice answered. Arthur Bellamy saw more than he said. Miss Marple turned. Eleanor Grant stood there, pale, holding her claim ticket too tightly. Their eyes met, and in that instant, Miss Marple understood. This auction was not an ending. It was a beginning. Outside, the sky darkened further. Somewhere, a door closed softly, and something long silent began to stir. Chapter 2: What the Mirror Never Forgot. In the days following the village auction, St. Mary Mead seemed to draw inward, as though the very hedges and brick walls wished to listen rather than speak. Conversations that once flowed easily now faltered. Greetings were exchanged with care. Doors closed a little faster, and curtains were drawn a little earlier in the evening. It was not grief that settled over the village, but awareness. The uncomfortable sense that something had been disturbed, something that had waited a long time to be noticed. Miss Jane Marple felt it keenly. She sensed it in the way the postman avoided lingering, in the manner Mrs. Price fumbled with her purse at the grocer's, and most of all, in the silence surrounding Arthur Bellamy's name. People spoke of the auction often, but rarely of the man whose possessions had filled the hall. It was as though he had been reduced to a collection of objects, his presence diluted until it felt safe. The mirror, however, refused to be diluted. Eleanor Grant had taken it home the very afternoon of the auction, though she claimed she had done so without much thought. It now rested against the wall of her sitting room, not yet hung, as if even she hesitated to give it a permanent place. Miss Marple paid her a visit under the pleasant excuse of returning a borrowed book, though both women understood that the mirror was the true reason for the call. The sitting room was neat, almost overly so. Cushions were arranged with care. Ornaments were evenly spaced. Yet the mirror disrupted the order simply by being there. Its glass caught the afternoon light in a way that flattened the room, draining it of warmth. Eleanor poured tea, her hands trembling just enough to notice. "I do not like how it feels," Eleanor said suddenly, before Miss Marple had spoken a word. "I thought I was being foolish, but it feels as though it watches the room even when no one stands before it." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Many things observe without eyes, my dear. People often forget that." Eleanor attempted a smile but failed. She sat opposite Miss Marple and wrapped both hands around her teacup as though grounding herself. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice low and careful. "Arthur Bellamy used to stand in front of it for long stretches of time. I noticed it once when I visited him to discuss the village reading program. He did not speak while he stood there. He simply looked, as though waiting for the glass to answer him." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, the spoon tapping once against the china. "Did he ever say what troubled him?" Eleanor shook her head. only that he had made a terrible mistake, and that he intended to correct it. Those words lingered in the room like smoke. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked past Willow End Cottage. The house sat dark and still, its windows reflecting the last pale light of day. She paused at the gate, recalling the single visit she had paid years earlier. The mirror had hung in the hallway then, directly opposite the door. Anyone entering the house would have seen themselves at once, framed by Arthur Bellamy's quiet life. She wondered what else it had reflected. Raised voices. Tense faces. The moment when truth first showed itself. The next morning brought news that shattered the fragile calm the village had been clinging to. Gerald Pike was dead. He was found at the foot of the stairs in his narrow townhouse, his body twisted unnaturally, his expression fixed in startled disbelief. The official word was accident. A misstep. A fall. Yet accidents rarely arrive with such precision or such terrible timing. Miss Marple attended the gathering that followed, the one villagers instinctively held when faced with tragedy. They filled the parlor of Mrs. Price's house, speaking in low tones, cups of tea untouched in their hands. Gerald's name was spoken often, but always followed by a pause, as though no one quite knew how to finish the thought. Miss Marple watched, and she listened. Mrs. Price dabbed her eyes too frequently, her glances flicking toward the hallway mirror behind her. Eleanor Grant sat stiffly on the edge of her chair, her gaze fixed on the floor. Colonel Harding paced, his movements sharp, controlled, his voice carrying too strongly whenever he spoke of how unfortunate it all was. Miss Marple noticed the small details. How Colonel Harding's hand clenched when Arthur Bellamy was mentioned. How Eleanor flinched at the sound of breaking crockery. How Mrs. Price repositioned herself so she no longer faced her own reflection. Later that night, Miss Marple stood alone before the mirror in Eleanor's sitting room. Eleanor had agreed reluctantly, leaving the room to give her privacy. The house was quiet. The ticking of the clock sounded loud in the stillness. Miss Marple studied her reflection. Age had etched lines into her face, but her eyes remained sharp. She raised one hand, watching the glass mimic her movement. For a moment, all seemed ordinary. Then she sensed it. Not a movement, not a sound, but a memory pressing forward. The mirror had reflected more than faces. It had absorbed moments of fear and guilt, of sudden decisions made too late to undo. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. She began to see the pattern clearly now. Arthur Bellamy had discovered something wrong with his possessions. Items replaced, values altered, histories rewritten. Gerald Pike, with his access and charm, had facilitated it. Others had benefited quietly, believing themselves clever and safe. Arthur had threatened to speak. Gerald had panicked. The mirror had watched as Arthur fell, his body striking the floor of the hallway, his final reflection one of shock rather than pain. And later, the mirror had watched Gerald return, desperate to reclaim what could betray him. Someone else had been watching then as well. Miss Marple stepped back from the glass. The mirror was not dangerous in itself. It was only honest. And honesty, when ignored for too long, becomes lethal. By morning, Miss Marple knew precisely what she must do. The truth would not reveal itself through confrontation or accusation alone. It required gathering, observation, and the careful placement of silence where people expected comfort. She sent out invitations for tea. One by one, they accepted, some eagerly, some with clear reluctance. Each believed the visit harmless. Each believed they could manage their own reflection. They were mistaken. The mirror had remembered everything. And soon, so would they. Chapter 3: The Silent Witness That Spoke at Last. By the time evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple had arranged her sitting room with quiet intention. Chairs were placed neither too close nor too far apart. The teapot rested on the side table, already warm. The curtains were half drawn, allowing the last of the daylight to fade slowly, so no one quite noticed when the room surrendered to shadow. In the corner, covered with a plain cloth, stood the mirror. They arrived one by one. Eleanor Grant came first, her steps hesitant, her coat still buttoned as though she might leave at any moment. Mrs. Price followed, breathless, offering apologies that no one had requested. Colonel Harding entered last, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral. Others drifted in as well, faces familiar from the auction, from church pews, from years of shared routine. All took tea. None truly relaxed. Miss Marple waited until the cups were set aside and the small talk faded of its own weight. She had learned long ago that silence, when allowed to linger, unsettles more effectively than accusation. "I am very grateful you could all come," she said at last, her voice gentle but clear. "These past days have been rather troubling, and I felt it best that we speak openly, together." No one responded. Eyes flicked toward one another, then away. "You see," Miss Marple continued, folding her hands in her lap, "villages are much like families. Secrets kept by one are eventually carried by all, whether they wish it or not." Mrs. Price shifted in her chair. Eleanor swallowed hard. Miss Marple rose slowly and crossed the room to the covered mirror. She paused there, allowing the anticipation to build, then drew the cloth away. The mirror caught the lamplight and reflected the room in full. Every face. Every movement. The effect was immediate. Eleanor turned her chair slightly. Mrs. Price lowered her gaze. Colonel Harding remained still, though a muscle in his jaw tightened. "This mirror once hung in the hallway of Willow End Cottage," Miss Marple said. "Anyone who entered that house would see themselves at once." Arthur Bellamy believed in facing things directly. It is rather tragic that others did not share his conviction. She turned back to them. Arthur discovered that items from his collection were being quietly replaced. Originals exchanged for copies. Over time, the loss amounted to a great deal indeed. He kept records. Dates. Names. He intended to go to the authorities. The room seemed to contract. Gerald Pike knew this, she went on. Arthur confronted him. There was an argument. Gerald lost control. Arthur fell. The mirror reflected it all. A sharp intake of breath escaped Eleanor. Mrs. Price pressed a hand to her mouth. Colonel Harding stood abruptly. "This is speculation," he said, his voice edged with anger. "There is no proof." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "On the contrary, there is proof." Arthur wrote everything down. He hid the records behind the mirror itself, within the frame. A place no one thought to look. Colonel Harding froze. After Arthur's death, Miss Marple continued, Gerald returned to the cottage. He believed the mirror might hold something dangerous. He intended to destroy it. But he did not come alone. She stepped closer to Colonel Harding now, though her tone remained mild. "You followed him. You feared he would speak. You feared he would trade your silence for his freedom. So you pushed him, just as he pushed Arthur." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Colonel Harding's composure crumbled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of truth. He sank back into his chair, his face grey. "I only meant to frighten him," he whispered. "I did not think he would fall." Miss Marple nodded once. "That is often how such things begin." The authorities were called. Statements were taken. The mirror was returned to Willow End Cottage, where it would trouble no one again. The records were recovered. Justice, long delayed, finally arrived. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead resumed its gentle routines. Shops reopened. Conversations returned, though with greater care. People pass mirrors without quite meeting their own eyes, reminded that reflection can be more revealing than intention. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the case settled, the silent witness finally heard. And if you have enjoyed this story, if you find yourself drawn to quiet villages, hidden truths, and mysteries solved not by force, but by careful observation and patience, do remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love classic mysteries. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and ensures that even the quietest witness is never ignored again.